Dr. Marcus Holloway was having what he considered a perfectly normal Tuesday morning when the aliens showed up. He was elbow-deep in Mrs. Patterson's root canal, listening to her mumble complaints about her ex-husband through a mouthful of cotton balls and dental equipment, when his receptionist knocked on the door with that particular brand of panic usually reserved for IRS audits and surprise health inspections. "Dr. Holloway," Janet whispered, cracking the door just wide enough to stick her head through, there are some very unusual people here to see you." Mac glanced at Mrs. Patterson, who was making the kind of grunting noises that suggested she was either trying to communicate or having some sort of medical emergency. "Unusual how? Are they from the licensing board? Because I told you we don't talk to them without a lawyer present." "No sir, they're not exactly people." Now Mac had been practicing dentistry for 15 years in downtown Cleveland, which meant he'd seen his fair share of unusual. He'd treated circus performers, method actors who refused to break character during cleanings, and that one guy who insisted on paying in cryptocurrency and kept trying to explain blockchain technology while Mac scraped plaque off his molars. But Janet looked genuinely rattled, and Janet had once calmly scheduled appointments while a patient was having a full-blown panic attack about fluoride mind control. "Give me 5 minutes, Mac said, patting Mrs. Patterson's shoulder. "Just relax, Helen. This won't take long." What greeted him in the waiting room defied every assumption he'd ever made about Tuesday mornings. 3 beings that looked like they'd escaped from the special effects department of a very expensive science fiction movie stood awkwardly among his collection of outdated magazines and that inspirational poster about flossing that he'd been meaning to replace for 6 years. The tallest one stepped forward, or at least performed what Mac assumed was the alien equivalent of stepping forward. It had too many joints in places joints shouldn't be, skin that seemed to shift between blue and purple depending on the angle, and eyes that blinked in sequence rather than simultaneously. "Dr. Marcus Holloway," it said in a voice that sounded like it was being filtered through several layers of expensive audio equipment, "we represent the Galactic Health Consortium. We have a proposition that could change the fate of 17 different star systems." Mac looked at Janet, who was gripping her appointment book like it might suddenly sprout wings and fly her to safety. He looked back at the aliens. He looked at his coffee mug, which still had steam rising from it, suggesting this wasn't some sort of elaborate hallucination brought on by too much caffeine and too little sleep. "Let me guess," Mac said, crossing his arms. "You're here about my student loans." The alien that had spoken made a sound that might have been laughter, if laughter typically sounded like wind chimes being fed through a garbage disposal. "Dr. Holloway, we have discovered something remarkable about your species. You are the only sentient beings in the known galaxy who can perform dental procedures without causing mass psychological trauma. Excuse me, every other species in the galaxy," the alien continued, "experiences what you might call extreme dental anxiety. Warriors who have conquered solar systems flee in terror at the sight of a dental pick. Beings who have stared into black holes and lived to tell about it have nervous breakdowns when confronted with the concept of oral hygiene." Mac glanced around his waiting room, taking in the faded carpet, the chair with the wobbly leg that he kept meaning to fix, and the fish tank that hadn't contained actual fish in 3 years but somehow still had algae growing in it. "So you're telling me," he said slowly, "that in a galaxy full of advanced civilizations with technology that lets you travel between stars, nobody has figured out how to clean teeth without causing psychological trauma." "Correct. And you think humans are special because we can handle dental work?" "Not just handle it, Dr. Holloway, you approach it with what can only be described as casual competence. You treat the invasion of oral cavities as routine, mundane, even." Mac looked at Mrs. Patterson, who was still in his chair making concerned noises through her cotton-stuffed mouth. He looked at Janet, who appeared to be questioning every life choice that had led her to this moment. He looked back at the aliens. 2 weeks later, Mac found himself floating in a space station that looked like someone had taken a shopping mall and crossed it with a medical textbook illustration of the digestive system. The Galactic Health Consortium had apparently spared no expense in making their dental facility as unsettling as possible, which Mac had to admit was quite an achievement considering they were dealing with patients who were already terrified of dental work. "Dr. Holloway," chirped his new assistant, a creature that looked like someone had crossed a butterfly with a nervous breakdown, "your first patient is here." Nurse Pip, as she'd introduced herself, had been fluttering around the station for the past 3 days in a state of constant anxiety that made Mac wonder if her species had evolved specifically to worry about things. Her wings made a sound like rustling paper every time she moved, and she had a habit of wringing her 4 hands whenever she spoke. "Great," Mac said, adjusting the dental chair that had been custom-built to accommodate patients ranging from humanoid to geometrically challenging. "What are we dealing with?" "Commander Vex of the Crystalline Horde." Pip squeaked, her wings beating so fast they became a blur. "He's a 12-foot-tall mantis warrior who has conquered 47 star systems and is afraid of dental floss." "Of course he is," Mac picked up a standard dental mirror and watched as Pip flinched away from it like he was brandishing a weapon of mass destruction. Let me guess, the sight of dental instruments causes him to molt uncontrollably or something equally dramatic. Actually, he just cries. The door to the examination room slid open with a sound like a starship's airlock, and Commander Vex entered. Mac had to crane his neck to take in the full scope of his patient. Vex was indeed 12 feet tall, with crystalline armor that refracted the overhead lights into rainbow patterns across the walls. His 4 arms ended in razor-sharp appendages that could probably slice through steel, and his compound eyes held the cold intelligence of a being who had spent decades perfecting the art of warfare. He took one look at Mac's dental tray and immediately started sobbing. There, Mac said in the same tone he used with his nephew when the kid scraped his knee. It's just a cleaning, Commander. Nothing to worry about. But the scraping, Vex wailed, his voice resonating through his crystal carapace like wind through a church organ. And the probing. And the judgmental questions about flossing habits. I promise I won't judge your flossing habits, Mac lied smoothly. He'd been judging people's flossing habits for 15 years. It was basically a professional requirement. Why don't you have a seat and we'll get started? It took 20 minutes to coax Commander Vex into the dental chair, during which time Mac learned that the crystalline horde's conquest of 47 star systems had been motivated primarily by their search for a species that could perform dental work without causing psychological trauma. Apparently they'd been flying around the galaxy with increasingly bad oral hygiene, growing more desperate and more conquest-happy with each failed attempt at finding a dentist. You know, Mac said, as he finally managed to get Vex to open his mouth, there are easier ways to find dental care than conquering entire civilizations. We tried the yellow pages, Vex mumbled around the dental dam. But every dentist we contacted either fled the sector or died of fright. Mac's second patient was even more challenging. Dr. Wisp was a gaseous entity that maintained a roughly humanoid shape through what appeared to be sheer force of will and a complicated system of containment fields. The problem was that every time Dr. Wisp got nervous, which was constantly, parts of him would disperse into the air conditioning system. This is highly irregular, Administrator Grex informed Mac as they watched tendrils of anxious gas seep through the ventilation grates. Grex was a blob-like creature who seemed to exist primarily to complain about paperwork and regulations. Dr. Wisp requires a specialized atmosphere for treatment. We've had to seal off 3 decks because of his anxiety attacks. Has anyone tried asking him what he's nervous about? Mac suggested. Asked him. Grex's blob-like form rippled with what Mac was learning to recognize as alien confusion. We've conducted extensive psychological evaluations, administered calming pheromones, and even tried hypnosis. Nothing works. Mac walked over to the vent where a small cloud of Dr. Wisp was hiding and crouched down. Hey there, he said in the same voice he used with scared kids. I'm Mac, I hear you need some dental work done. A faint whisper emerged from the vent. Are you going to hurt me? Nope, just a routine cleaning. Have you ever had your teeth cleaned before? I don't actually have teeth, Dr. Wisp admitted, his gaseous form slowly coalescing back into something vaguely person-shaped. But I have these crystalline formations that serve a similar function, and they've been bothering me for decades. Well then, Mac said, let's take a look and see what we can do. As it turned out, Dr. Wisp's problem wasn't dental anxiety so much as embarrassment about his crystalline formations, which had grown into elaborate decorative patterns that he was convinced made him look ridiculous. Mac spent the next hour explaining that oral health was nothing to be ashamed of while carefully polishing formations that sparkled like tiny chandeliers. By the end of his first day, Mac had treated a warrior who conquered star systems, a gaseous entity with performance anxiety, and something that looked like a cross between a squid and a filing cabinet, but turned out to be surprisingly chatty once you got it talking about its hobbies. Dr. Holloway, Pip said as they cleaned up the examination room. You make this look so easy. Mac was 3 days into what he was generously calling his galactic dental residency when the emergency klaxons started blaring. He looked up from his current patient, a slug-like creature who had been explaining its complex feelings about mouthwash for the better part of an hour, and watched as every alien in the facility began displaying what he assumed were their species' equivalent of panic. Pip burst through the door, all 4 arms flailing and her wings beating so frantically she was practically hovering. Dr. Holloway, we have a code red dental emergency. Is that a real thing or did someone just make that up? Mac asked, setting down his dental pick. It's real. Administrator Grex oozed into the room behind Pip, his blob-like form quivering with what Mac was learning to recognize as bureaucratic terror. We've received a priority transmission from the Omega sector. It's Korath the Terrible. Mac waited for this to mean something to him. When it didn't, he made the universal gesture for please continue explaining why I should care. Korath is a Class 7 space dragon, Grex continued, his form rippling with each word. He's approximately 400 feet long, capable of breathing plasma hot enough to melt starship hulls, and has been the undisputed warlord of the Omega Sector for the past 6 centuries. He's also currently threatening to incinerate every inhabited planet in a 12-parsec radius unless someone fixes his tooth. His tooth? Mac asked. Apparently he has an infected wisdom tooth, Pip squeaked. The pain has been driving him insane for the past 3 weeks. Every dentist in 3-star systems has either fled to different galaxies or is currently hiding in bunkers hoping he forgets about them. Mac absorbed this information while his slug patient continued making concerned gurgling noises about fluoride content. So let me get this straight. We have a 400-foot space dragon with a toothache who's threatening to commit genocide unless someone gives him a root canal. That's correct, Grex confirmed. And every qualified dentist in the area has decided that discretion is the better part of valor. Also correct. Mac looked at Pip, who was vibrating at a frequency that was making the dental instruments rattle. He looked at Grex, whose blob-like form had taken on the consistency of nervous pudding. He looked at his slug patient, who had stopped talking about mouthwash and was now making what sounded like prayers in a language that consisted entirely of different types of gurgling. Well, Mac said, I suppose this is why they brought me here. The silence that followed this statement was so complete that Mac could hear the space station's life support systems humming in the background. Dr. Holloway, Pip whispered. You can't be serious. This is Korath the Terrible. He once destroyed an entire solar system because someone criticized his poetry. His poetry? He writes haikus about conquest. Grex explained. They're apparently quite bad. Mac considered this. In his 15 years of practice, he'd dealt with difficult patients before. There was Mrs. Chen, who insisted on critiquing his technique while he worked. There was that kid who bit him during a routine cleaning and somehow drew blood. There was his own nephew, who once threw such an epic tantrum about getting his teeth cleaned that Mac had to resort to bribery, distraction, and what amounted to hostage negotiation. How big did you say his mouth was? Mac asked. Dr. Holloway. Grex's form was now actively quivering. This is not a matter of technical capability. This is Korath the Terrible. Beings across the galaxy tell stories about him to frighten their children. He has personally ended more civilizations than some species have words for numbers. But he has a toothache, Mac pointed out. Yes. And he wants someone to fix it. Well, yes. But the point is, Mac interrupted, that somewhere out there is a 400-foot dragon with a wisdom tooth infection, and he's in pain. And pain makes everyone cranky, whether you're a toddler in Cleveland or a space dragon in the Omega Sector. The slug patient made a sound that might have been agreement, or might have been the alien equivalent of "you're completely insane, but I respect your professional dedication." Dr. Holloway, Pip said, her voice reaching frequencies that were probably only audible to dogs and certain types of space bat. Even if you could somehow perform dental surgery on a Class 7 space dragon, which is physically impossible, you'd have to get close enough to his mouth to do it. His mouth, which is filled with plasma hot enough to vaporize small moons. Has anyone asked him to turn down the plasma? Max suggested. The silence returned, but this time it had a different quality. It was the silence of beings who had spent so much time being terrified of something that they'd never considered the possibility of just asking it nicely to cooperate. You want to ask Korath the Terrible to please tone down his weaponized breath so you can perform dental surgery, Grex said slowly. Why not? The worst he can do is say no. The worst he can do is incinerate you, along with this entire station, and probably several nearby planets for good measure. Mac shrugged. I've had worse Tuesdays. He looked around at the assembled aliens, all of whom were displaying various species-specific signs of disbelief and terror. Look, here's the thing about pain. It doesn't matter if you're the most feared creature in the galaxy, or a kindergartner afraid of the dentist. When something hurts, you want it to stop hurting. And right now, Korath has a tooth that's probably throbbing so bad he can't think straight. But he's threatening to destroy planets, Pip protested. Have you ever had an infected wisdom tooth? Mac asked. Because I have. And I can tell you that after about day 3, planetary destruction starts to seem like a perfectly reasonable response to the pain. The slug patient made another gurgling sound that Mac chose to interpret as supportive. Dr. Holloway, Grex said, his form solidifying slightly as he shifted into what Mac was learning to recognize as his official administrator mode. If you're serious about this, I'll need to file a tremendous amount of paperwork. Liability waivers, next of kin notifications, last will and testament forms, several different types of insurance claims, and at least 14 different varieties of diplomatic immunity requests. The next morning, Mac found himself standing in what had formerly been the station's cargo bay, now hastily converted into what Grex kept referring to as the Dragon Preparation Facility, with the kind of reverence usually reserved for funeral homes or tax preparation offices. "Dr. Holloway," Pip announced, consulting a clipboard that was vibrating in her 4 hands. "The engineering team has finished scaling up your equipment specifications." Mac looked around at what could generously be described as dental equipment and more accurately described as industrial machinery with a medical degree. The dental chair had been replaced with something that looked like a launch platform for small spacecraft. The overhead light was now roughly the size of a small sun and required its own power generator. The dental pick had been reinforced with materials normally used to construct starship hulls. "Is that my suction device?" Mac asked, pointing to what appeared to be a vacuum system capable of cleaning out asteroid mining tunnels. "The engineers assure me it's rated for Class 7 dragon saliva," Pip squeaked. "Apparently dragon saliva has corrosive properties that can eat through most known metals." "Of course it does." Mac walked over to examine the scaling up job on his Novocaine supply, which now came in containers the size of fuel tanks. "Please tell me someone remembered to adjust the dosage calculations." "Oh yes." Grex oozed over carrying a data pad that was smoking slightly around the edges. "According to our xenobiology experts, a Class 7 space dragon would require approximately 4,000 times the standard humanoid dose of anesthetic to achieve numbness in the oral cavity." 4,000 times. "That's the conservative estimate," Grax confirmed. "The liberal estimate involves numbers that most species don't have words for." Mac did some quick mental math and decided he didn't want to think too hard about what injecting that much Novocaine into anything would do. "What about the mouthwash?" "Industrial strength," Pip announced proudly, pointing to a series of tanks that looked like they belonged in a chemical processing plant. "The antimicrobial agents have been concentrated to the point where they're technically classified as a controlled substance in 17 different star systems." "Perfect." Mac picked up what had once been a standard dental mirror, and was now a piece of reflective equipment that required 2 people to carry. "Any word from our patient?" As if summoned by the question, the communication system crackled to life with a sound like a volcano clearing its throat. "Attention insignificant beings," boomed a voice that made the entire station vibrate. "This is Korath the Terrible, scourge of the Omega Sector, destroyer of civilizations, and winner of the Galactic Poetry Slam Championship for 6 consecutive years." "He won poetry competitions?" Mac asked. "Apparently intimidation works very well in competitive poetry," Grex whispered. "I have been informed that one of you microscopic creatures believes he can treat my dental affliction," Korath continued, his voice causing several pieces of equipment to rattle loose from their mountings. "I find this prospect both amusing and unlikely." Mac walked over to the communication panel and pressed what he hoped was the talk button. "This is Dr. Marcus Holloway. I understand you have an infected wisdom tooth that's been bothering you." The silence that followed was so complete that Mac wondered if he'd accidentally hung up on a space dragon. "You speak to me as if I were a patient," Korath said finally, his voice dropping from galactic threat to merely very large person with a toothache. "Well, you are a patient," Mac pointed out. "You have a dental problem, and I'm a dentist. That's pretty much the definition of a patient-doctor relationship. But I am Korath the Terrible, I'm sure you are. And I bet that tooth is terrible too. When did you first notice the pain?" Another pause. In the background, Mac could hear what sounded like confused rumbling, as if Korath was conferring with someone. 3 weeks ago, Korath admitted. "It began as a minor irritation during the conquest of the Sigma Quadrant, but it has progressively worsened to the point where I can no longer concentrate on proper intimidation techniques." "Has it been interfering with your sleep?" "I do not sleep. I enter a state of restful vigilance." "Has it been interfering with your restful vigilance?" "Yes." Mac nodded to himself. "What about eating? Any sensitivity to hot or cold foods?" "Everything is sensitive," Korath wailed, his voice cracking slightly. "I attempted to consume a small moon yesterday, and the pain was so intense I could only manage half of it." "That sounds like a pretty advanced infection," Mac said sympathetically. "The good news is that it's completely treatable. I'm going to need you to come to our station so I can take a look." "You wish me to travel to your location? Unless you have a better idea. I've got all the equipment ready, and I think we can have you feeling better by this time tomorrow." The pause that followed was filled with the kind of silence that suggested Korath was having thoughts he'd never had before. "No one has ever offered to make me feel better," he said quietly. Mac looked at Pip, who was crying what appeared to be tears of terror and sympathy simultaneously. He looked at Grex, whose blob-like form had taken on the consistency of emotional pudding. "Well," Mac said, "that's what dentists are for." I will consider your proposal," Korath announced, his voice regaining some of its previous thunderous quality. But be warned, tiny healing creature. If you attempt to deceive me or cause me additional pain, I will transform your star system into a very large cloud of radioactive dust. Understood? Oh, and Korath, yes, try to avoid eating anything too hard or chewy until we get that tooth taken care of. Maybe stick to gas giants for now. That is reasonable advice. I will comply. The communication system clicked off, leaving the cargo bay in stunned silence. Dr. Holloway, Pip whispered. I think you just gave dietary advice to the most feared creature in the galaxy. Mac looked around at the industrial-scale dental equipment, the reinforced treatment bay, and the enough anesthetic to knock out a small army. Mac was reviewing his notes on Class 7 Dragon dental anatomy, which turned out to be surprisingly similar to regular Dragon dental anatomy, except with more molten components, when the proximity alarm started screaming. Through the reinforced viewing port, he watched as something the size of a city block blotted out the stars. Dr. Holloway, Pip announced, her voice reaching frequencies that probably violated several intergalactic noise ordinances. Korath has arrived. I can see that. Mac watched as the space dragon maneuvered himself toward the station's docking bay, with surprising grace for something that was essentially a flying mountain with teeth. Is he trying to fit through the airlock? The engineering team had to remove the entire outer hull section, Grex informed him, consulting a clipboard that was now on fire. Korath will be extending his head into the modified cargo bay through what used to be the north wall. Mac nodded as if this was a perfectly normal sentence. Right. Well, let's get this show on the road. The process of getting Korath positioned for dental work took approximately 3 hours and involved what Mac could only describe as the most polite destruction of a space station he'd ever witnessed. Korath apologized profusely each time his movements caused structural damage, and at one point actually offered to pay for repairs. I am attempting to be gentle, Korath explained as his left wing accidentally punched a hole through what had been the cafeteria. But I am not accustomed to interacting with structures that are not designed to be destroyed. You're doing fine, Mac assured him, watching as maintenance crews sealed off the sections of the station that were now open to space. Just try to keep your head still once we get started. When Korath finally managed to position his massive head in the cargo bay, Mac got his first good look at what he was dealing with. The dragon's mouth was roughly the size of a subway tunnel, lined with teeth that looked like crystal formations designed by someone with a doctorate in intimidation and a minor in structural engineering. Okay, Korath, Mac said, his voice echoing slightly in the cavernous space. I'm going to need you to open wide for me. The dragon's jaw dropped open, revealing a mouth that seemed to extend approximately halfway to infinity. The infected wisdom tooth was immediately obvious, a crystalline molar the size of a compact car that was glowing with an angry red light and producing what appeared to be its own weather system. Oh wow, Mac muttered, consulting his scaled-up dental mirror. That is definitely infected. Is it very bad? Korath asked, his voice now muffled by having his mouth open but still loud enough to rattle Mac's dental equipment. It's not great, Mac admitted, but I've seen worse. This was a lie. He had definitely never seen worse. The infection had spread to the point where the tooth was essentially hosting its own miniature volcanic ecosystem. The good news is that we can fix this. The less good news is that it's going to require a root canal. What is a root canal? Mac explained the procedure while setting up his equipment, which now required a small crane to maneuver. As he talked, he noticed that Korath's posture was gradually relaxing, his massive form settling into what appeared to be a more comfortable position. You speak of this procedure as if it were routine, Korath observed. Well, it is routine, Mac said, testing the industrial strength suction system. I mean, the scale is a bit unusual, but the basic principle is the same whether you're a space dragon or a kindergartner. I have never been compared to a kindergartner. How do you feel about that? Korath considered this question with the gravity of someone who had spent centuries being the most feared creature in the galaxy. It is not unpleasant. Mac began the procedure, which turned out to be surprisingly similar to regular root canal work except that everything was on fire and occasionally tried to eat his equipment. The Novocaine, administered via what was essentially a fire hose, took effect quickly, and Korath's massive form went limp with relief. Oh, the dragon sighed, his voice dropping to what was probably a whisper by his standards but still sounded like distant thunder. Oh, that feels so much better already. The numbness will help with the pain, Mac explained as he began the delicate process of cleaning out the infected tooth with equipment that had been borrowed from a mining operation. How long has it been since your last dental cleaning, Korath? I have never had a dental cleaning. Mac paused in his work. Never. Dragons do not traditionally seek dental care. It is considered a sign of weakness. That's ridiculous, Mac said, returning to his work. Dental hygiene is basic self-care. There's nothing weak about taking care of your teeth. But I am supposed to be terrible and feared. You can be terrible and feared and still floss regularly, Mac pointed out. In fact, I bet you'd be even more intimidating if your teeth weren't bothering you all the time. As he worked, Mac found himself falling into the same conversational rhythm he used with all his patients. He explained what he was doing, offered reassurance when Korath tensed up, and gradually learned that the galaxy's most feared dragon was actually quite chatty once you got him talking. I write poetry, Korath confided as Mac worked on cleaning out the infected root canal. So I heard. What kind of poetry? Hakis about conquest, Mosley. Would you like to hear one? Sure. Planets burn brightly, Korath recited. Civilizations crumble fast. I need dental care. Mac paused in his work. Did you just write that one? Yes. Is it good? It's very honest, Mac said diplomatically. Maybe we can work on your technique during your follow-up appointments. I will have follow-up appointments every 6 months, Mac confirmed. We'll want to keep an eye on your oral health, and I think a professional cleaning twice a year would do you a world of good. The actual root canal took 4 hours, during which time Mac learned that Korath collected vintage starship models, had strong opinions about interstellar politics, and was surprisingly knowledgeable about botany. By the time Mac was sealing the clean tooth with a filling that had been specially formulated to withstand plasma breath, they were chatting like old friends. There, Mac announced, stepping back to admire his work. How does that feel? Korath carefully closed his mouth, then opened it again experimentally. A look of wonder crossed his enormous reptilian features. The pain is gone, he whispered. For the first time in weeks, the pain is completely gone. That's what we like to hear, Mac said, beginning to clean up his equipment. Remember what I said about avoiding hard foods for the next few days, and try to rinse with that antimicrobial solution twice a day. Holloway, Korath said, his voice taking on a formal quality. I wish to make a declaration. Mac looked up from his equipment. Okay? You have done something no being in the galaxy has ever done. You have made Korath the Terrible feel better. For this I am in your debt. You don't owe me anything, Korath. That's what dentists do. The space dragon's enormous eyes blinked slowly. 3 months later, Mac was beginning to understand that his life had taken a turn that no amount of dental school could have prepared him for. He was currently standing in what had formerly been the station's observation deck and was now his appointment scheduling center, watching Korath carefully maneuver a ship the size of Manhattan through an asteroid field without so much as scratching the paint. Dr. Holloway, Pipe announced, fluttering over with a scheduling tablet that was glowing ominously. Your 3 o'clock is here. Mac looked through the reinforced viewing port at Korath, who was attempting to park his dreadnought in a space designed for considerably smaller vessels. The dragon had insisted on keeping his appointment for his 6-month cleaning, despite the fact that he was currently in the middle of what he described as aggressive negotiations with the Centauri Republic. How are the aggressive negotiations going? Mac asked as Korath's massive head appeared in the cargo bay opening. Quite well, Korath replied, settling into position with the practiced ease of someone who had now undergone 3 separate dental procedures. The Centauri ambassador was initially resistant to our territorial proposals, but when I mentioned that I had a dentist appointment to keep and therefore could not extend the conquest past Thursday, he became much more cooperative. You're using dental appointments as a diplomatic tool. It is surprisingly effective. Beings across the galaxy have heard that Korath the Terrible maintains excellent oral hygiene. This has enhanced my reputation considerably. Mac began setting up his cleaning equipment, which was now a well-practiced routine. How so? Apparently, there is nothing more terrifying than a conqueror who takes proper care of his teeth, Korath explained, opening his mouth for the preliminary examination. The implication is that I am organized, disciplined, and forward-thinking enough to schedule regular dental care while also managing galactic conquest. That's actually a very good point, Mac admitted, beginning the cleaning process. How's that sensitivity we talked about last time? Much better since I started using the spatial toothpaste you recommended. Though I should mention that the toothpaste designed for plasma breath apparently doubles as an excellent starship fuel additive. Mac made a note to discuss this with the manufacturers. Any new areas of concern? As he worked, Mac reflected on how dramatically his patient roster had expanded. Word of Korath's successful treatment had spread through the galaxy with the speed that only really good gossip can achieve. It turned out that every major civilization had at least one terrifying entity with dental problems, and they were all suddenly very interested in the human dentist who could treat galaxy-destroying monsters without breaking a sweat. Dr. Holloway, Grex oozed into the treatment area, carrying what appeared to be 17 different tablets and looking like a bureaucrat who had found his calling. I have your schedule for next week. Hit me. Monday. You have the Hive Queen of Epsilon Eridani. She's been putting off a root canal for 3 centuries because she's afraid it will affect her ability to command her trillion-strong insect army. Reasonable concern. What's Tuesday? Admiral Vorthak, Supreme Commander of the Void Fleet. Apparently he's been avoiding dental care because he's convinced that anesthesia will interfere with his psychic connection to his battleships. Also reasonable. Wednesday. The Crystalline Emperor of the Diamond Nebula. He's been growing decorative plaque formations for aesthetic reasons, but they've become infected and now they're affecting his ability to refract light properly. Mac nodded as he continued Korath's cleaning. This was his life now. Somehow, by treating dental problems like dental problems regardless of who was attached to them, he'd become the galaxy's most unlikely diplomatic asset. Oh Dr. Holloway. Korath interjected. I have excellent news. My latest poetry collection has been selected for the Galactic Arts Foundation's annual anthology. That's wonderful. What's it called? Reflections on Conquest and Oral Hygiene, A Journey from Terrible to Terrifyingly Well-Groomed. Catchy title. The publisher believes it will inspire other galactic warlords to seek proper dental care. Mac paused in his work. Are you telling me that you're writing self-help poetry for space tyrants? I prefer to think of it as motivational literature for the conquest inclined. The cleaning process continued in companionable silence for a few minutes, broken only by the sound of industrial-strength dental equipment and Korath's occasional comments about interstellar politics. Mac found himself thinking about his old practice in Cleveland, with its faded carpet and wobbly chairs. He wondered what Mrs. Patterson would think if she knew her dentist was now the galaxy's premier provider of care for entities capable of destroying solar systems. Dr. Holloway. Pip fluttered over. You have an urgent communication from Earth. Mac looked up from his work. Earth? The communication panel crackled to life, and suddenly Mac was looking at Janet, his former receptionist, who appeared to be calling from his old office. Dr. Holloway. Janet's voice was tight with barely controlled panic. Thank goodness I reached you. We have a situation here. What kind of situation? Mrs. Patterson's grandson is here for his checkup and he's having what I can only describe as a level 5 meltdown about getting his teeth cleaned. He's barricaded himself in the bathroom and is demanding to speak to the space dentist who makes dragons feel better. Mac looked at Korath, who was following this conversation with the kind of intense interest usually reserved for matters of galactic importance. Put him on the comm, Mac said. A few minutes later, a small defiant voice emerged from the communication system. Are you really the dentist who fixed a dragon's teeth? I am, Mac confirmed. What's your name? Tommy. And I don't want to get my teeth cleaned because it's scary and it might hurt. Well, Tommy, Mac said. I understand being scared, but you know what? Getting your teeth cleaned is actually pretty easy. In fact, it's a lot easier than cleaning dragon teeth. Really? Really? Dragons have much bigger mouths and their teeth are on fire and they write poetry while you're working on them. Human mouths are much more straightforward. There was a pause. The dragon writes poetry. Oh yes, Korath interjected, his voice booming through the communication system. I am Korath the Terrible, and I write Hakus. Dr. Holloway is an excellent dentist. You should listen to him about dental hygiene. The silence that followed was the silence of a small boy processing the fact that he was receiving dental advice from a legendary space dragon. Okay, Tommy said finally. If the dragon says it's okay, I guess I can get my teeth cleaned. Max smiled as he heard Janet scheduling Tommy's appointment. There you go, Korath. You're officially a role model. I find this both unexpected and deeply satisfying, Korath admitted. As Mac finished up Korath's cleaning, he reflected on the strange turn his career had taken. He'd started out as a dentist in Cleveland, dealing with routine cleanings and the occasional difficult patient. Now he was somehow the galaxy's premier provider of dental care to entities that most civilizations used as cautionary tales. All done, Mac announced, stepping back from his work. Your teeth look great, Korath. Same time in 6 months? Absolutely, Korath confirmed, carefully maneuvering his massive head back toward his ship. And Dr. Holloway. Yeah, thank you. Not just for the dental care, but for treating me like a patient instead of a monster. Mac watched as the space dragon carefully piloted his dreadnought away from the station, probably heading back to his aggressive negotiations with the Centauri Republic. Through the viewing port, He could see 3 more massive shapes approaching his afternoon appointments, most likely. Dr. Holloway. Pip said, consulting her eternally glowing tablet. Your 4 o'clock is here. It's the Nebula Empress. She's apparently been avoiding dental care for 2 millennia because she's made of sentient gas and isn't sure if traditional cleaning methods will work. Mac looked around at his space station dental practice, with its industrial-scale equipment and patients who could end civilizations if they sneezed wrong. He thought about Tommy back on Earth, who was probably getting his teeth cleaned right now with a story about space dragons to keep him brave. Well, he said, picking up his scaled-up dental instruments, I suppose it's just another day at the office, Dr. Holloway. Pip asked. Yeah? Do you ever miss your old practice on Earth? Mac considered this as he watched the Nebula Empress attempt to condense herself into something resembling a patient shape. You know what, Pip? Cleveland was nice, but I think I like having patients who appreciate good dental care enough to write poetry about it. And with that, Dr. Marcus Holloway, formerly of Cleveland, Ohio, currently of wherever the galaxy needed a dentist who wasn't afraid of a little plasma breath, got back to work.